one of four. About midnight on Tuesday, January 25, 1876, 5 masked men entered the house of John Whittlesey in Northampton, Massachusetts. Mr. Whittlesey was the cashier of the Northampton National Bank, and was known to have in his possession the keys of the bank building and the combination to the bank vault. The 5 men entered the house noiselessly, with the aid of false keys, previously prepared. Passing upstairs to the sleeping apartments, they overpowered 7 inmates of the house, gagging and binding them so that resistance or alarm was impossible. These were Mr. Whittlesey and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. T. B. Cutler, Miss Mattie White, Miss Benton, and a servant girl. The bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Whittlesey was entered by 2 men who seemed to be leaders of the band. One wore a long linen duster buttoned nearly to the knees, also gloves and overshoes, the other wore a jacket and overalls. Both men had their faces concealed behind masks, and one of them carried a dark lantern. On entering the room, the 2 men went directly to the bed, one standing on either side, and handcuffed Mr. Whittlesey and his wife. Both carried revolvers. The proceedings were much the same in the other rooms. After some delay and whispered consultation, the robbers ordered the 5 women to get up and dress. When they had done so, they were roped together by ankles and wrists, and taken into a small room, where they were kept under guard by one of the band. Mr. Cutler also was imprisoned in the same way. Then the 2 leaders devoted themselves to Mr. Whittlesey. They told him plainly that they had come for the keys of the bank and the combination of the vault, and that they would "make it hot" for him unless he gave them what they wanted. Mr. Whittlesey replied that it was useless to attempt to break into the bank, as the locks were too strong for their efforts and he would not betray his trust. At this the man in the linen duster shrugged his shoulders and said they would see about that. Mr. Whittlesey was then taken downstairs, and again summoned to surrender the keys. Again he refused. At this the man in the overalls put his hand in the cashier's trousers pocket and drew forth a key. "Is this the key to the bank?" he asked. "Yes, it is," answered the cashier, hoping to gain time. "You lie," said the robber, with threatening gesture, at the same time trying the key in the lock of the front door of the house, which it turned. "Don't hit him yet," said the other, "he is sick." Then he asked Mr. Whittlesey if he wanted a drink of brandy. Mr. Whittlesey shook his head no. Then the man in the linen duster renewed his demands. He wanted the combination of the vault. Mr. Whittlesey gave him some figures, which the robber wrote down on a piece of paper. These were for the outer door of the vault. He demanded the combination for the inner door, and Mr. Whittlesey gave him other figures. Having written these down also, the robber came close to his prisoner and said, "Will you swear these figures are correct?" "I will," answered Mr. Whittlesey. "You are lying again. If they are correct, let's hear you repeat them." The cashier could not do this, and so disclosed that the figures were not the right ones. "See, number 1, said the robber, addressing his comrade, "we're wasting time, we'll have to teach him to stop lying." As he spoke he struck the sharp point of his lead pencil into Mr. Whittlesey's face so violently as to make a wound, and followed this with several blows on the body. "Will you tell us now?" he asked. Mr. Whittlesey kept silent. Then both men came at him, wringing his ears, shaking him by the throat, hurling him to the floor, and pounding their knees into his chest. For 3 hours this torture was continued. More than once the ruffians placed their revolvers at Mr. Whittlesey's head, declaring they would blow his brains out unless he yielded. Finally he did yield. The suffering was too great, the supreme instinct of self-preservation asserted itself. Toward 4 o'clock in the morning, bruised from head to foot, and worn beyond further resistance, he surrendered the keys, and revealed the true combination of the vault. Then the robbers went away, leaving 2 of their associates to watch over the prisoners. One of the band, before his departure, did not disdain to search Mr. Whittlesey's clothes and take his watch and chain and $14 in money. The last of the band remained in the house until 6 o'clock, and it was an hour later before Mr. Whittlesey succeeded in freeing himself from his bonds. He hurried at once to the bank, arriving there soon after 7 o'clock. He found the vault door locked, and its dials broken off, so that it was impossible at the moment to determine the extent of the robbery, or, indeed, whether there had been any robbery. It was necessary to send to New York for an expert before the vault could be opened, which was not accomplished until late that night, 20 hours after the attack had been made. Then it was found that the robbers had been only too successful, having secured money and securities estimated at $1,250,000. Much of this sum was safe deposits, and the loss fell on the depositors, and to some it was the loss of their whole property. At this time the authorities had no clue to the identity of the robbers, though they had left behind them numerous evidences of their presence, such as dark lanterns, masks, sledge hammers, overshoes, and the like. Their escape had been managed as skillfully as the robbery itself. Sheriff's officers and detectives did their best during subsequent days and weeks, but their efforts were in vain. The president of the bank offered a reward of $25,000 for the apprehension of the robbers and the return of the property, but there were no discoveries. When several months had elapsed, the Pinkertons were called into the case. They began by carefully studying certain communications that had been received by the bank directors from persons claiming to have in their possession the missing securities. The first of these communications was dated New York, February 27, 1876, about a month after the robbery. It ran as follows, the letters of each word being carefully printed with a pen, so that there was little chance of identification through the handwriting. Dear Sirs, when you are satisfied with detective skill you can make a proposition to us, the holders, and if you are liberal we may be able to do business with you. If you entertain any such ideas, please insert a personal in the New York Herald, address to XXX, and sign Rufus, to which due attention will be paid. To satisfy you that we hold papers, we send you a couple of pieces, no signature. No attention had been paid to this letter, although 2 certificates of stock accompanied it which had undoubtedly been in the bank's vault. 3 other letters of a similar nature had been received later. To one of these the bank people had sent a guarded reply, which had called forth the following response, dated New York, October 20, 1876. Gentlemen, since you have seen fit to recognize the receipt of our letter, we will now send you our price for the return of the goods. The United States coupon bonds and money taken cannot be returned, but everything else, bonds, letters, and papers, to the smallest document, will be returned for $150,000. If these figures suit you, we will make arrangements, according to our promise, and you may have the goods as soon as preliminaries can be arranged for the safe conduct of the business. If you agree to this price, insert in the New York Herald personal column the simple word Agatha. Respectfully, etc. Rufus. The special value of these letters was in helping the detectives to decide which one of several gangs of bank robbers then operating in the country was most likely to have committed the crime. Being familiar with the methods of each gang, Robert Pinkerton was able to draw useful inferences from evidence that would otherwise have been insignificant. He knew, for instance, that the notorious gang headed by James Dunlap would be more apt than any other to thus negotiate for the return of all the securities in a lump, since it was Dunlap's invariable rule to insist upon personally controlling the proceeds of his robberies until final disposition was made of them. On the other hand, the gangs headed respectively by the notorious Jimmy Hope, Worcester Sam, and George Bliss might have divided the securities among the members, and then tried to negotiate a compromise on the individual portions. A fact of much significance to the Pinkertons was the rather remarkable interest in the case, and apparent familiarity with it, shown by one J. G. Evans, an expert in safes and vaults and the representative of one of the largest safe manufactories in the country. The day after the robbery Evans had been at Bristol, Connecticut, in the interest of his firm, who, on receipt of the news, had immediately wired him to proceed to Northampton. His presence in Northampton was regarded as nothing strange, for he had been there several times during the months just preceding the robbery, and once had inspected the lock and dials of the vault of the robbed bank. What did seem a little strange, however, was Evans's evident interest in the negotiations for a compromise. On a dozen different occasions he talked with the president and other officers of the bank regarding the robbery, and insinuated quite plainly that he might be in a position to assist them in recovering their lost securities. A few months after the robbery he even went so far as to tell one of the directors that he could name the members of the gang.